social media, videos not verified by NBC News described as protests by people desperate to get food and medicine. Store shelves cleared out. This man on the street yelling, "What am I supposed to buy? What am I supposed to eat?" In some areas, drones telling people to stay home. Control your soul's desire for freedom, it says.
And in this video, the residents yell at the police at one point. They say, "We are starving."
We are starving, they scream at stony-faced police as drones overhead tell them to stop longing for freedom. This is, again, the richest city in China, and you never thought you'd see anything like this. So the question is, what is going on here? Obviously, it's not about COVID. Let's stop pretending. Shanghai does not have a COVID crisis. Even if Shanghai did have a COVID crisis, we know perfectly well from recent experience, this is not the way to handle a COVID crisis. So from the perspective of China's central government, the problem is not COVID. The problem is Shanghai itself. Shanghai is probably the freest place in China. It's certainly got more foreign nationals than any city in China. They're drawn by the trade that revolves around its historic port. So by Chinese standards, Shanghai is an independent-minded city. And that's the problem. For authoritarians, independent-mindedness is the main threat. If you're the head of the Communist Party of China and you're trying to run a highly volatile country of 1.4 billion people from Beijing, naturally your top concern always will be Shanghai. Shanghai is the one place a meaningful insurrection might start. And that's especially true this year. Xi Jinping, the Chinese autocrat, is set to take a third consecutive term beginning in the fall. Now, that was not supposed to happen. There were term limits in China. But 4 years ago, the Chinese Communist Party did away with those term limits, and Xi Jinping can now rule the country forever. Even in China, that is a controversial move. As a China expert called Natasha Kassam put it, quote, "From Beijing's perspective, there is no higher priority than stability ahead of the party Congress this fall. This is the closest you might come to seeing a campaign season in China." Oh, there it is right there. A campaign season. Even in an authoritarian country, public opinion still matters. A campaign season is still real, even if you're president for life. Sound familiar? So China's rulers want to stay in power forever. And in order to do that, they're using COVID restrictions. They're pretty sure COVID restrictions work. They watched our last presidential election closely. Now, how should we respond to this? If you believe in democracy, this is repugnant. 25 million people just lost their most basic human rights. So the question is anyone in the Biden administration, which is constantly lecturing us about democracy and human rights, said anything about this? Has the State Department issued an angry denunciation of Xi Jinping? Is the U.S. government threatening sanctions against China for building the world's largest prison camp? Well, of course not. Effectively, our leaders are defending what China is doing. Here's Tony Fauci admitting on camera he will never criticize the Chinese government.
We spoke to one of the WHO investigators who'd been to Wuhan to investigate how the virus started, and they were prevented from seeing key details and from speaking to key people. Why do you think the Chinese government did that?
You know, I don't want to create any or mention any disparaging remarks about that, but the Chinese are very closed in a way of being very reluctant, particularly when you have a disease that evolves in their country. They become extremely secretive, even though there's no reason to be secretive. I think they were very concerned and maybe embarrassed that the virus evolved from their country, but there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, so they lied about an international pandemic that they clearly had a hand in creating, but according to Tony Fauci, there was, quote, nothing wrong with the Chinese government lying about COVID. There's certainly nothing wrong with starving the population of Shanghai. He would have said so if there were. In fact, Shanghai may be a model. A longtime Harvard epidemiologist called Eric Feigelding just wrote an op-ed explaining that we should all be grateful for the atrocities the Chinese government is committing in Shanghai tonight, because they're in, quote, everyone's interest. A health security expert called Nicholas Thomas just told CNN that Shanghai is an inspiration to the world's leaders. Quote, "The legacy of Shanghai will see a return to mass lockdowns for larger cities in the near to medium term." And if you watch carefully, you can see all of this taking shape. And why wouldn't it be taking shape in this country? We've got midterm elections coming, and the ruling party is predicted to be in tough shape. So they're doing something about it. In the city of Philadelphia, authorities just announced the return of an indoor mask mandate. Is there science to justify this? Philadelphia has a 7-day average of 2 COVID deaths. 2 COVID deaths in a city of 1.5 million people over a week. Now, of course, when your strategy is, quote, COVID zero, 2 dead from COVID is more than enough to justify another mass quarantine. According to a report tonight, the Biden administration plans to bring back its lunatic vax mandate for federal employees. And of course, the mask mandate remains in effect for all commercial air travel in this country, though not for Nancy Pelosi's private plane, despite no scientific evidence at all that it works. But you must obey anyway, and they're making sure. At Love Field in Dallas, 2 robots, known as Security Control Observation Towers, SCOT for short, scan the crowd to make sure that everyone is in compliance. Now, with facial recognition software, the robots could know exactly who the disobedient are. We're just beginning to see the outlines of the repression that COVID has made possible. That's the point. And if you want to know what the future looks like, you can look at China and shiver. In the state of California, the state is starting to pull funding from any school that won't comply with a new mandate, a vaccine mandate for children. Joe Biden endorses that. Inject your children with a drug with no actual benefits or no education for your family.